When Commodore released the Amiga 500 in 1987, competition with Atari Corp all of a sudden became fierce and eventually deadly. Commodore had released a vastly superior hardware from the expensive Amiga 1000 in a compact and cheaper computer, aiming for the market segment our beloved low-budget Atari ST computer was designed for. The difference in price became minimal, but the computer with the custom chips designed by former Atari engineer Jay Miner had a lot more firepower to fight this war. And so the tables turned quickly. Atari had to act fast, and only 2 years later, 2 full years, after a complete development hell which probably caused main hardware engineer Shiraz Shivi to leave the company, they released this thing over here, the Atari STe. The STe had nothing of the promised 256 color capabilities and the high resolution modes. Okay, the palette was upgraded to 4096 colors and there was an enhanced blitter chip added, but the resolutions stayed the same. We still had the 8 MHz CPU, but worst of all, the STe was still only capable of displaying 16 colors at once on screen. Meanwhile, the Amiga 500 was selling like hotcakes. Atari had already sold a lot of regular STs, and the differences between the ST and the STe just were not big enough. So most developers did not bother to enhance their Amiga conversions to the capabilities of the STe. In the end, STe owners only had a handful of games which really displayed what the machine was capable of. But this has been changing in the past years. And the game we're talking about today, of which a fan-made STe enhanced version has just been released, is a beautiful example of what the STe can do. But is it as good as the original Amiga version? Let's start from the very beginning. And if you haven't already done so, hit the like button and welcome to the show. By the end of the 80s, it was clear for most game developers the Amiga was the way forward. This was also the case for Shaun and Andrew Morris. They already had some experience creating games on 16-bit machines, their biggest game by then being Supercars, a super sprint-like top-hat racer, using their development company Magnetic Fields. But for their next release, they really wanted to make a difference. The idea for a shoot-'em-up was quickly canned, so they opted again for a racing game, but this time designed with the hardware capabilities of the Amiga in mind. A fast road routine was programmed by Shaun, and the split-screen gameplay from the previous work on the conversion of Trailblazer for the Commodore 64 was also integrated. Some Porsche cars were added, and with this demo they went back to Gremlin Graphics, who already published Supercars. And they loved it. Gremlin had just acquired the Lotus license, so the Porsches were dropped and replaced by the famous Lotus Esprit. So the duo continued developing their game around the capabilities of the Amiga. The blitter chip was used for everything. At first, the scrolling hardware was considered, but because the game would also have hills and go up and down, this wasn't sufficient. So the blitter was used to put everything as fast as possible on screen. It was a bit of true coding genius that generated the tracks in this game. All cars and other objects were created as flat sprites in all sizes, and it was again the blitter that put them all on screen. It was this approach which enabled so many cars simultaneously on screen, while the game stayed blazingly fast. The programmers always had an arcade racer in mind, with realism on a second place. But Lotus was not only about speed. To create tension, you had a limited amount of fuel, and taking pit stops was key to winning the game. There also was a simple collision detection system, which on impact slowed the car down. And since it wasn't a simulation, you could not damage your car. And in one player mode, you only had computer controlled cars, so a rudimentary AI was created. In essence, the AI cars just moved from left to right at a certain speed, even in tight turns. They all have a set speed forward, until they reach an opponent car. Then they switch speeds. This had the effect of the car racing away from you, suddenly slowing down. This was done so developers did not have to bother with computer controlled cars overtaking each other. Gamers didn't notice, and it ended up adding to the gameplay. When Lotus hit the shelves, the Amiga world was raving about the game. It had amazing magazine scores, and to this day it is considered one of the best racers on the system. So a conversion to the still popular ST was gonna happen. But some compromise had to be made. The only STs with a blitter inside were the Mega STs, and they were used for serious applications. And of course, the fairly new STe. A lot of STs were also sold with only 512 kilobytes of RAM. It is clear that Shaun wanted the ST version to be fast and available to as many people as possible, so it had to run on a vanilla ST with only half a meg of RAM. Almost no memory consuming pre-shifting, a technique often used to smoothen sideways animation in machines without blitter, was used. Instead, the graphics on the road and side were toned down, and the smooth side-scrolling cars now moved in blocks of 16 pixels. It gave the game a choppier look, but the feeling of speed was retained. Gone was the gradient background sky as well. On the plus side, the number of objects and cars was the same as on the Amiga. Finally, the pumping mod music was converted to typical YM chiptunes. When you compare both games directly, the ST version might seem bad, but this was not the case, far from it. The game still looked good, it was very fast, and the chiptunes sounded great. Shaun did an excellent conversion. Also on the ST, the game got a very warm welcome, with ST format giving it a nice 86%. So in conclusion, the official release of Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge on the ST was a great game, very well made, but vastly inferior to the Amiga counterparts, for obvious reasons. But wait, this is not the end of the story yet.
Looking for a powerful home computer? This is the one. Texas Instruments home computer.
For Jonathan, it started on the Texas Instruments TI-99, where he began coding in BASIC. Being a car freak himself, he always wanted to create a racing game. He had it all planned out. The game would be called Nigel Mansell's Grand Prix, but he didn't get much further than placing the car sprite on screen before he lost interest in computers. Until around 1988, when he asked his mom to buy a computer magazine. This was issue 10 of the Games Machine, and inside was an article about the game Overlander on the Atari ST. Jonathan got obsessed, and after a lot of nagging, he received an Atari 520 STM, which came bundled with the game. After Overlander, other racing games followed. F1 Grand Prix, of course Lotus, Toyota Celica, Super Hang-On and Stunt Car Racer, just to name a few. It took a few years before he started programming in DOS BASIC on the Atari ST, but by 1993 he moved on to the PC. End of story? Nope. Thanks to emulation, Jonathan got into the retro scene again. He started reverse engineering the Atari Arcade Classic pole position. This time he wanted to create the ultimate version of this game for the Atari STe using the blitter, and by 2017 the conversion was released. After a break of 2 years, Jonathan was on the lookout for a new project. He checked a lot of racing games, but eventually decided to go for Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge for two main reasons. He knew there was a big difference between the ST and the Amiga versions, and after assessing the code, it was clear to him that his road drawing blitter routines he had written for the pole position conversion would greatly benefit this game. So by the end of 2019, a proof of concept was released. But still, it took almost a whole year to complete. Jonathan explains that in the Amiga, all the custom chips are working together in perfect harmony, as this is how the machine was designed. The blitter in the Atari, however, feels like a third-party add-on, especially in the context of gaming. Instead of the blitter doing calculations in the background while the rest of the ST carries on, Jonathan had noticed that the blitter stops the CPU in its track while it renders the car sprite, and once the 68000 gets control back, the music has been delayed, the sky gradient is broken, and so on. This was such a frustration, he canned the project, until he got a lot of help in the past month from the community. And now we have a version for the Atari with gradient skies, smooth sideways scrolling, DMA sound effects and lots of graphical details, almost identical to the Amiga, apart from the music. Playing mod-type music with similar clarity to the Amiga, but with a strict limit on RAM usage, takes around 45% processing time. This would have decimated the fast-paced gameplay, so they opted to keep the YM soundtrack, which is cool, as it still feels resolutely like an ST game. So the question on everyone's mind: is this new enhanced version of Lotus as good as the original on the Amiga? Well, no, but the gap has become really small, and it's a nice example of what could have been done on the enhanced system if Atari had handled matters better, and if developers got more time and incentives to create these versions. It wasn't really a case of outdoing the Amiga, rather to get as close as realistically possible. And that on its own is an incredible accomplishment. Oh, you're still watching? You are the best of the best. Thank you so much, but we've reached the end of the show. Did you know? They made 2 sequels to Lotus. John, did you know that? I'm just saying. Well, stay Atari, take care, bye.